A group of teenagers worldwide have become the driving force for radical change in policy and financing on a global level around the issue of climate change. And they, of course, arguing that it threatens the very world we live in. They've demanded that the United Nations stop talking and take action. Joining me to unpack the measures to put forward to combat climate change in the global Green Deal is Dr. Diana Barrowclough, as well as a senior economist, or rather she is a senior economist at the United Nations Conference of Trade and Development, and Gilad Isaacs, who is the co-director at the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa. Thank you so very much for joining us. Diana, let me start with you. In the paper that you have put together on the question around trade and development and financing the global Green Deal, you talk about good times and bad times. Just quickly take us through what the global financial situation looks like, and how possible is a global Green Deal, and how financeable is it?
Okay, well, firstly, good morning, Karima. Thank you for inviting me to share our message. Can you hear me well?
Okay, we seem to have a technical problem in getting you on the line. I'm going to ask my producer to fix that. But in the meantime, let me speak and bring Gilad in. Gilad, you had the opportunity to interface with Diane. The global environment for the Green Deal, some have argued, is a capitalist global environment that is in a crisis, and that it doesn't really matter how you tinker at the edges. What you need is a complete structural overhaul of the global economy. Are you of that view?
Well, what's really interesting in the UNCTAD report, which is an excellent report, is essentially they link the structure of the global economy and the broad dynamics of that, in particular the financialization of the economy, the expanding role of finance, and how financial instability impacts all of our lives is the central theme to the report. And the argument which they make is that in the current framework, the current existing economic framework and policy framework, we will be unable to take the steps necessary to finance and to change policy in a way to become environmentally sustainable. So actually the report links exactly what you asked, and say that the functioning of modern capitalism at the moment is incompatible with the achievement of environmental sustainability. And I would certainly agree with that.
But the report also says, and I'm just going to hold it up to my camera, it says, capitalism, time for a reset. Now, of course, that essentially and implicitly implies that capitalism is the financial, or rather the economic system in which it can be done. Is that true?
So, I mean, that what you've showed now comes from the front page of the Financial Times about 3 weeks ago, maybe, which was a big deal for the FT, to have this huge banner on their front page. I think there's different schools of thought, right? There are people who legitimately argue that you can tame the system which we have now, like we had in the 1950s, 1960s, and in particular that calls for a taming and a re-regulation of finance and a rethinking of our monetary policies. And then there are those who argue that the system is fundamentally incompatible, that the drive for profit is incompatible with a sustainable agenda.
Okay, let me try and bring Diana in again. I'm not sure if our connection is stable. Diana, Gilad and I have been speaking about resetting the button on capitalism, because as far as a lot of even orthodox economists are concerned, it's incompatible with developing a sustainable world and to deal effectively with climate change. What is your view on that?
Thanks, Karima. I mean, I think that's a really great question. Well, the FT page that you mentioned, it says capitalism, time for a reset. So then we're not trying to do away with capitalism. I mean, capitalism is a pretty good system for delivering development benefits to a lot of people, but capitalism's got hijacked. It's gone off the rails, you know. So the current system that we have of capitalism we've called it a rigged system. Actually, I mean it's not fair. It's also not working. And I think it was interesting. Your previous speaker said something along the lines of, you know, is it time to leave the orthodoxy?
Yes.
Should we leave orthodoxy? Well, you know, we're human beings. We have very short memories. You know, this system of economics that we have at the moment, it's only 20 years or so that we've done this you know, highly financialized system where, you know, money is the driver of everything. Finance drives the economy as compared to finance serving the economy. So the things that we think of orthodoxy are really only for the last 20 years. You know, we're talking about this global New Deal. You know, this was extremely unorthodox, you know, when it was first put in place in the 1930s by President Roosevelt, the very first time they did this. But he was also fighting against a capitalism system that had got quite out of kilter and, again, dominated by finance, you know, that caused the Great Depression.
But, Gilad, let me bring you in here. How you know, effective will such a deal be, given the fact that we're not really living in a multilateral globe? We're living in a globe where the president of the most powerful country in the world is a climate change denier.
No, absolutely. And the report does very well in identifying that multilateralism is actually a central element for how we must move forward. At the same time, we need to also take steps locally. Mark Swelling was speaking earlier about ways in which South Africa, one of the 14th largest emitter globally per capita, you know, can make steps locally towards a green future. I think what we've seen in terms of the climate protests globally, that there's certainly, whilst there is a aversion to multilateralism amongst some of our leaders, the climate movement itself is an incredibly international one, and that's hopeful for us.
Absolutely. Diane, let me bring you in here. We've seen this movement grow across the world. We've seen indigenous communities. We've seen, you know, from South Africa to Norway, from Norway to Canada. Everywhere in the world, this has become the issue of our time. The big question, of course, is how do you finance such a deal, given the fact that the biggest or largest economy in the world is led by a man who denies climate change?
Well, I mean, that's the question that everybody raises, isn't it? That's the stumbling block. They say, oh, you know, you've got this idealistic view of saving the world, but how are we going to pay for it? Well, you know, I think we've argued pretty strongly in this report, and I should say we're not the only voice, you know, saying this. There actually is the money. I mean, there's trillions and trillions of dollars out there sloshing around, looking for a home and looking for a way to make a profit. And what we're showing in this report is that actually the kind of investments that are needed for a Green New Deal, you can think of it as an insurance, you know, insurance against the economy tanking worse and the environment getting worse. But you can also see it as an investment in the future. And frankly, it's one that I think we're not going to have much choice about if we don't do it. I think what's very sort of special about this moment is that bringing together these anxieties about the environment and also the anxieties about the economy, and they are interlinked. I mean, it's not just by chance that we've got both these two massive anxieties at the same time, but therein is also the opportunity to do something about it. And, you know, I mean, if I was a political leader, I would be thinking about all these amazing young people as they're either voting already or they'll be voting pretty soon.
Yes.
You know, I'd be listening to them. And also these investments we're talking about, we're not just throwing money into a bucket when we talk about Green New Deal. We're talking about throwing money into things that actually create a lot of jobs. It creates millions of jobs when you change to a new sustainable, renewable energy source. And when you create jobs, you get incomes for workers who then buy products. And so you do get this virtuous capitalistic cycle.
Okay, so you're talking about the creation of jobs, but Gilad, let's bring it home to South Africa. In South Africa, we've got what is touted as a just transition. Most of the trade unions have actually come out against, independent power producers and different ways of doing it, because we've got a lot invested in coal, a lot of jobs at stake. We've got an unemployment rate of, 36%. Can we afford to do this if the transition isn't just, and if you don't have the social compact vehicles to drive a just transition?
Yeah, I mean, what we've definitely seen is an opposition to particular forms of renewable energy here. But that doesn't mean an opposition to renewable energy in and of itself, right? The IPP model, despite the fact that we need renewables, is currently quite flawed. The report does an excellent job, actually, which the Treasury would well take heed of, in noting that the methodologies around public-private partnerships, greater private sector investment in these core industries has actually globally failed. It's failed to mobilize resources. It's led to dysfunctional investment patterns. And so the resistance is not necessarily resistance to renewables per se. It's a resistance to a particular manifestation of how those work, right? And what needs to be developed coherently is what a just transition plan looks like, which is driven by the public sector, which prioritizes public sector investment, and which prioritizes employment. And indeed, what you mentioned about moving away from orthodoxies is really important. I think Hilary Joffe, that was on your segment earlier, is incorrect when she says that monetary policy only plays a short-term stabilizing role. There's actually substantial scope for monetary policy to ensure larger investment in South Africa, whether that's the Reserve Bank mandate or whether that is moderating forms of capital flows. So we certainly need to move away from the orthodoxies and explore a comprehensive plan.
Diana, let me bring you in here. In your plan, or in the report, which is entitled Where the Money Comes From, the section that deals with that, the big question is, can we afford it? And you say, can we afford not to do it? And of course, that is the key question that young people have put on the table. So lay it out for us. Where can this money come from? And more importantly, you speak a lot about public investment and publicly owned banks and public development finance institutions. Now, we have a lot of that in place in South Africa. The problem is we had a very inefficient government. We had state capture that raided the coffers and saw those institutions as ATMs for their personal gain. How do you establish these public institutions but prevent governments from misusing them and, in fact, using it as a way to enrich themselves?
Yeah, that's a question. The easy answer to that is there isn't one that I can say. I've been to meetings also in South Africa. I've been part of these discussions also about how to turn around governance issues, and of course it's a massive challenge. The first thing I would have to say is that the money is there. The money does exist there. It exists at the global level, and it also exists at the national level. So
in South Africa, Diana, so I need to interrupt you. Give me an example of where we could get money from to fund these initiatives.
Sure. Well, just thinking about capital flows, for example. South African rands, the majority of South African rands are actually not held in South Africa. They're flowing in the global economy, flicking back and forth and being used in carry trade or derivatives, or invested overseas. And if they are invested overseas in advanced economies, they're earning interest rate or they're earning returns that are only half what they would earn in South Africa. So, that's a massive opportunity cost for starters. We have something in our report, it's in the chapter on finance, that we showed that foreign investment in South Africa is earning something like 5%, but your South African rands invested internationally are only earning about 2.5%. So, you're already paying twice as much to keep the money, offshore as you would be having if you invested at home. So that's a big thing already to start with. Then there's obviously tax evasion and base shifting. So that would be, we've got $700 billion, I think, estimated that would be saved by that. Subsidies to the fossil fuel sector, according to the IMF, that's worth something like $5 trillion a year. So these are huge amounts of money. The problem is not the lack of money. The problem more is having the plan and using it correctly, and that's in a way what you're mentioning, isn't it? That how do you have a good marriage between a public sector that you trust and that you can see that the money is being invested in the correct way, and then the private sector that picks it up and also plays their role. And it's.
Let me bring Gilad in here. Gilad, last week I spoke with Logan Ward from the African Transformation Tax Forum, and he said that the biggest problem in Africa is the illicit flows of cash, and that, Africa is actually not collecting the kind of tax revenues that they can because of the way in which people can slip in between. Illicit cash flows is a huge problem in South Africa as well. What are the measures that the report proposes, both globally and in local situations, to deal with that and redirect that investment?
Yeah. Well, that is a huge problem here. We actually saw a court case launched this week by UNCTAD, the AIDC, by Richard Spoor, against the sort of profit shifting by a mining company. And in South Africa, we've seen it from Lonmin and from elsewhere. In terms of the measures, there are both local and global. There's no doubt that there needs to be global tax regulation, right? We need to be able to close down tax havens. We need to be able to assess and regulate flows on the side to which they are arriving as well as the side to which they're leaving. On the South African side, we need to increase capacity within SARS. As we know, it's been gutted in terms of its investigative capacity. And we need to develop new systems for tracking those flows in the first place. And we need to make sure that we globally, and the OECD has been leading in this, make certain practices illegal. So at the moment, you've got, for instance, mines selling their minerals at below market prices to entities housed in tax havens. So they show a lower profit here, and then those entities on-sell that at market rates, and the profits made elsewhere, right? Yes. And so those sorts of practices need to be regulated globally in the same way that we regulate trade.
But now, Diana, if you taking that as a starting point and as an initiative, it literally challenges both private and political elites in the developed world. And you're not going to get no pushback. In fact, you're going to get a lot of pushback. We don't have multilateralism. So which platform does this Green Deal even get tabled on to even get discussed in a way that is meaningful, never mind implementable?
Look, I mean, it is being discussed right now. I think we're seeing this. It's being discussed, we're discussing it right now here in South Africa, but it's actually being discussed all over the world. And so all countries are looking at this issue. So individually, all countries are, struggling with it, and many seeing it as a big opportunity that they can, do something about. seeing it as an opportunity also to, be the producer and exporter of those green products that people are going to want. But as you say, then no one country can do it alone. So they do have to do it together. And the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, these are the places to be discussing it. But as you say, this is the problem, is that the multilateral system is currently in a state of crisis, and it's not picking up. It's not picking up the leadership that's needed, and I think this is really a serious problem for us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. This is, of course, a discussion that we will have in the future. Diana from Geneva, thank you so much. Gilad, thank you for coming in from the Institute for Economic Justice. Still ahead, we take a look at the stories making headlines in the weekend newspapers. Stay tuned.